Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the IndieZone Podcast. My name is Kathy. During part one, our last episode of this multiple part series where we are going through the 175-page certified copy of the hearing transcript from the January 23rd, 2025 closed sealed hearing, Detective Payne was on the stand. There was some conversation between the court and Ms. Taylor, who was conducting a direct examination of him. This went on for several pages of the transcript. You can read the transcript, follow the link that I provided in this episode of the IndieZone description. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to skip down to page 24 because this is where Detective Payne then the examination continues. At line number 8, we see Ms. Taylor finishing up with the court saying, "Absolutely, I understand that, Your Honor. I don't expect the court to read my mind. Thank you for that." Question. Detective, I'm going to attempt to put this map up here. Is that the map that you and Nicholas Balance came up with to help with probable cause? Answer, yes, ma'am. Question, thank you. I'm going to leave that there for just a minute and I'm going to ask you some other questions. I want to back up to the part of the first affidavit. This is asking for AT&T records. Is that right? We're at line 23. Detective Payne responds, yes, ma'am. Question, and this AT&T record, is that the first set, 48 hours of AT&T records? This is the end of page 24, going on to 25, line 1. Detective Payne responds, yes, ma'am, I believe so. Question, and are these AT&T records related to a phone Mr. Kohberger had? Yes, ma'am, is the answer. All right. And so in doing this affidavit, you have this working document, and I'm going to start with D as in David, M as in Mary. If I say DM, do you know who I'm talking about? Detective Payne responds, yes, ma'am, I do. And she is one of the roommates. Is that right, Ms. Taylor? Ask the court. We're sealed. You can use the name. Ms. Taylor says, I can use the name. Trying to get a habit. By Ms. Taylor. Detective, who is she? Answer, she was one of the surviving roommates. Question, and how many times was redacted interviewed by law enforcement at the time you wrote this December 23rd report? Line 23, answer, if memory serves, it was 4. I think 3 or 4. Line 25, question, in the affidavit you wrote a statement, and we go on to the next page, that she had heard Kaylee go upstairs, yell, someone's here, and run back downstairs. Is that correct? Line 3, yes, ma'am. Question, and you use the words, quote, she thought she heard, end quote. Do you remember that? Line 6, Ms. Jennings, Your Honor, I'm going to object. I'm objecting based on the scope of what this testimony is supposed to be. My understanding was it was limited solely to the issue of Franks and IGG. Line 10, the court. I was just about to ask the question. I don't recall the statements of redacted being a subject of a motion to suppress separate from the Franks issue. Am I correct about that? Line 14. Ms. Taylor, that is correct, Your Honor. Line 15. Okay, the court says. So we're not at a Franks hearing on that issue. The only issue we are at a Franks hearing on is the IGG. Line 18, Ms. Taylor. All right. Well, let me rephrase. Let me start from a different place. Line 20, the court. I'll sustain the objection. 21, by Ms. Taylor. Question. Let's go to the part of your affidavit for December 23rd, AT&T/1. The part where you put a things particular to Brian Kohberger, line 25. You put in that affidavit a traffic, and we go to the next page, page 27, line 1. A traffic stop, I believe, from August in Moscow, Idaho. Is that right? Line 3. Detective Payne answers, yes, ma'am. Question, that traffic stop, was that on your radar before December 19th when you learned of Brian Kohberger's name? Line 7, no, ma'am. 8. Question, the next thing you relied on was a traffic stop at WSU. Is that right? Answer, yes, ma'am. Question, was that traffic stop on your radar before you knew of Brian Kohberger's name on December 19th? Line 14, no, ma'am. 15. Question, you put in information about front license plate being missing from Pennsylvania cars. Is that right? Line 18, yes, ma'am. Question, the 1112 video did not show enough of the vehicle that you could see whether it had a front license plate. Is that right? Line 22, answer, that sounds correct, yes. Question, so it was after you learned of Brian Kohberger's name that became part of your affidavit. Is that right? This is the end of page 27. We go into page 28. Line 3, yes, ma'am. Question, let's talk about the vehicle identification for a minute before I run back down through the rest of the affidavit after Brian was identified. Line 6, when you worked with Special Agent Imel to identify a vehicle, was there more than one vehicle he identified? Line 9, I don't believe there was. If memory serves, it was just the Hyundai Elantra. Line 11, question, would you agree that he was most comfortable with the years 2011 to 13? Line 13, Ms. Jennings, object, Your Honor, for the same reason. I don't understand the scope related to IGG. Line 15, Ms. Taylor, Your Honor, I'm going to ask for a little leeway on this one. I think it will be clear in about 2 more questions. It is a sealed proceeding. I'll be arguing it around Franks. 19, the court, I don't want to pollute the record, so approach. Then there was a bench conference. This is when the attorneys approach the bench and there's a conversation. They go back on the record. Line 22, Ms. Taylor, they looked for a 2011 to a 2013. It was their BOLO, B-O-L-O, be on the lookout. It was after Brian was identified by IGG. They expanded the search. Line 25, the court, that relates to what? This is the end of page 28 going into 29. Ms. Taylor, it's going to relate to Franks, but it has to do with the IGG and when they identified him. I have about 2 more questions along this line. The court, you have the separate Franks motion regarding the scope of the car search. Ms. Taylor, absolutely. The court, that we're not here for that today. We're here for the IGG. I get the idea that if the IGG is suppressed, the warrants based on IGG is suppressed. That affidavit, a lot of other things, right? But I don't think you need to get into the evidence of that at this point because it's part of the Franks. There's a separate Franks motion on that. Ms. Taylor, there absolutely is. The next question I'm going to get to in the affidavit after the IGG was the police in Pullman running the car, and he has laid it out in the affidavit after the IGG without stating it. So she's continuing to try to argue that she should be able to ask further 1 or more questions of Detective Payne regarding the car and the identification of the car. We've learned here that the camera at 1112 didn't have enough power, or it was a different angle, but it wasn't able to determine if there was a missing front license plate because at that time, Mr. Kohberger's car was a Pennsylvania registered car, and in Pennsylvania, unlike in Idaho, you just need to have a back license plate. You don't need a front and a back. So there's a little bit more conversation here, and the court says, counsel, Ms. Jennings, I don't understand what this has to do with the IGG. It's part of a Frank's hearing related to vehicle identification. I understand her, and it's going into the next page, timeline, but I think the point has already been made. Ms. Taylor says, this was when I was allowed to explore this witness. He's already here, and we've paid for him to come here. The court, yeah, but I didn't open up everything to Frank's because we couldn't get into all the other things that I understand we could get into the entirety of Frank's Ray IGG, which is why I allowed it. And that's what we're going to stick to today. Ms. Taylor, IGG flows. It makes everything. The court, well, I'm not suggesting we get into other Frank's issues that sprung in part from IGG because those are separate based, right? And I don't think we need to talk about the specific IGG stuff today. This is Judge Hippler speaking in terms of Frank's. There's not a separate motion to suppress based solely on that and not the IGG, if I'm not mistaken, apart from the Frank's motion. Ms. Taylor, to suppress, which I'm not following. I'm sorry, the court. There are motions to suppress that are not Frank's related. Ms. Taylor, right, I'm not going there. The court, that's evidence we can put on today, but I thought we were going to do that later today. This is the end of page 30 going into 31. Ms. Taylor, absolutely. The court, there are various Frank's motions, one of which is to suppress. One of the Frank's motions is that there was a Frank's violation by not informing the magistrate of the use of IGG in violations. As you allege then in obtaining the IGG, that's the issue we're doing today in terms of evidence, and I want to stick to that. So getting into the car, which is separate, which I understood your argument is the IGG, led them to expand the search of the cars, but that's not the Frank's issue itself. The Frank's issue itself on IGG is the IGG itself. And it's limited to that, Ms. Taylor. All right. Bench conference continues. So the end of the conversation between the court and the lawyers, and the court goes, I'm going to sustain the objection by Ms. Taylor. She continues questioning Mr. Payne. Question. All the things in the warrant that became particular to Brian Kohberger were not on your radar before you learned his identity through IGG. Is that correct? Answer. Yes, ma'am. Detective Payne responds. Question. And you elected not to put the IGG identification in your probable cause affidavit. Is that right? This is the bottom of page 31, top of page 32. Yes, ma'am. Question. What led to that decision? Answer. That decision was a collaborative decision. We made that decision in an effort to independently verify the information that was provided to us as a tip from the feds. In much the same way we would any other tip in law enforcement. So it was not in any way meant to obfuscate any sort of information. It simply was, can we validate Mr. Kohberger's involvement in this incident, or can we not? That was it. So he's continuing to assert here, this was just a tip from the feds that came to the Moscow Police Department the evening of December 19th, 2022. That was information that came from the earlier part of his testimony here that was in part 1 of this multi-part episode of the IndieZone Podcast. Continuing on, line 12. Question. As a group effort, you decided to intentionally leave that out of your affidavit. Answer. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Taylor, given the limitations in this point, I think that's all my questions. The court. All right. End of line 17. Cross-examination by Ms. Jennings. Good morning, detective. I only have one question for you. Let's go back to December 19th, December 20th, and the information that was provided to the team, correct? It was a team. This is the top of the next page, line 1. Mr. Payne responds, yes, ma'am. Question. And who all was part of this team that was receiving this information telephonically from the feds? Detective Payne responds, oh, there were several of us. Yourself, Mr. Thompson was there, Darren Gilbalton from the Idaho State Police, Ed Jacobson from the feds. I believe there were a couple more folks from the feds and ISP in the room. I don't remember exactly who they were, and then myself. There was numerous people that were involved. Next question. Would it have been essentially the team leaders from the investigation? Answer, yes. Question. Was this any different from the other information sharing that occurred during this case? Answer, not at all. Question. There were routine team discussions. Answers, yes, ma'am. We had 2 official briefings every day of the investigation, morning and evening. So twice a day, we would all link up. And that was not just the command team. This was everyone who worked, who was not actively on all interview, would come back to the police department, sit in the same room, and we go on to the next page, discuss the information that we learned from that day. So it was very common throughout the investigation for us to all be in the same room. Detective Payne is now recalling what would happen. It appears there were 2-time-a-day meetings where they would all come back together and share perhaps what was learned that day. There would be a meeting in the morning, and then, as he testifies here, in the evening, and it was meant to share information. Next question from Ms. Jennings. So you were not the only investigator receiving information from various sources? A, answer, absolutely not. Question. So when we talk about this Exhibit A, that wasn't necessarily just your Exhibit A. Answer, Detective Payne says, no, ma'am, it was not. Question. It was all the information that the investigators had up to that point. Answer, yes, ma'am. That is an accurate statement. Question from Ms. Jennings. Now, related to the IGG and the information you were provided by the feds, is that information providing? Did you receive any material information about Brian Kohberger? A, no, ma'am, we did not. Question. I don't have anything further. Thank you. The court. Redirect. He's asking Ms. Taylor. Ms. Taylor responds, yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Redirect examination. We continue on to page 36 by Ms. Taylor. Ms. Jennings was just talking to you about the team, I guess, that got together a couple times a day from November 13th until December 19th or 20th. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. Question. From the feds. Who from the feds was part of those daily meetings? Answer. Like I said, S.A. Jacobson was there. Maria Tidal was there. I believe Special Agent Rob Hille was involved. I'm trying to think of other names. I can't remember any. There were others there. I just don't remember who they were. I apologize. That's okay, she says. How about who else from Moscow Police Department? Answer. Captain Blacker was there. I believe really Detective Vargas was there. Usually Detective Vargas was there. Sometimes Chief Fry would sit in on those meetings. Most nights Chief Fry would sit in on those meetings? Captain Dallinger, Anthony Dallinger, who was then, after Chief Fry retired from the Moscow Police Department last year, Dallinger became the chief of Moscow Police Department, ladies and gentlemen. So Dallinger was involved in those meetings, according to Detective Payne. I'm trying to think of all the others. Basically, the whole command team from MPD itself would be in those meetings, and then whoever else, and then it goes to the next page, was available from the investigation section would also come in. Question, who from ISP was there? Answer, Darren Gilbertson was there. I believe Detective Joe Luke was there most days. I can't remember who else was consistently there. I remember those two for sure. Lieutenant Mike Mooney was in those meetings. That was the three off the top in my head. When was the first time you talked about identification of Brian Kohberger in those meetings? Line 13, as far as when we knew of him? Line 14, yeah. Answer, December 19th. Question, how many hours of meetings do you think you had up until the identification of Brian Kohberger? Answer, goodness, many. I don't know. It was a lot. Question, twice a day, every day? Answer, yes, ma'am. Question, 7 days a week? Answer, if not more than that, yeah. Ms. Taylor then asked, line 25, thank you. That's it. And then the next page, line 1, the court, thank you, detective. You can step down now. Defense can call its next witness. Line number 4, Ms. Taylor, I'm sorry, the court, you can call your next witness. We're going to stop here because now Ms. Taylor is going to call Raylene Newland to the stand. We will pick up with her testimony in the next episode of the Indie Zone, but just basically we're learning here from Detective Payne that there were daily meetings of who was involved in these meetings, and we will continue on to learn what happened behind the scenes that we're learning for the first time here in our next episode of the Indie Zone podcast. In the meantime, you can read this transcript for yourself if you go to the link that I have provided in the description to this podcast episode. Go down to where it says transcript. It was released February 21st, 2025. And please join us again for part 3. Thank you.